Coming from the Associated Press, black graves are being moved to make way for an industrial park, drawing a mix of emotions. A decision to move the remains of hundreds of African American tenant farmers from a former Virginia tobacco plantation to a dedicated burial ground has elicited a range of emotions among the sharecroppers' descendants. Some worry about the implications of disturbing the graves of people who were exploited and enslaved. Others hope the remains can be identified and reburied with more respect than they were afforded in life. How about we stop disrespecting marginalized grave sites? Because this is never a discussion and the land is never up for sale when those that are in the ground lived under the complexion for protection. The mostly unidentified remains are being moved from a site that had been part of one of the nation's largest slave-owning operations to make way for an industrial park. So even in death, it's more important to partake in capitalism than humanity. Noted. Oh, noted. When they were buried, they weren't considered fully human. Correction, they weren't considered human at all. But now, they are patriots who are coming out of their graves with equal rights in 2025. One descendant, Cedric Hairston, said, "Are they patriots? By the standards of the United States?" Archaeologists have already started exhuming the approximately 275 plots, and some of the remains of tenant farmers and their families are already in a funeral home, but will be moved to a new burial site about a mile away. If it's just a mile, why not put the industrial park there? Officials have been consulting with descendants about genetic testing on unidentified remains as well as designs for the new cemetery, including a memorial archway. Why not put the memorial archway where they were buried, where they toiled, where they reclaimed their respect? Because in moving them, you also move the centralization of the narrative, which means you can alter it. "I don't think anybody would want their ancestors exhumed or moved," said Jeff Bennett, whose great-great-great-grandfather was buried at the plantation. "But for them to give us a lot of say-so in the new cemetery, down to the design details and the plaques and memorials that we put up, I feel like they're really doing it in a dignified way and a respectful way. Respect would be leaving our ancestors unbothered and unmoved. They bothered them and moved them enough against their will in life. They deserve and earned their peace." African American cemeteries have suffered neglect, abandonment, and destruction over the centuries because most don't know that they're cemeteries. They weren't exactly properly marked or marked in a way that was compatible to be noticed by Euro-Americans. But efforts to preserve them are gaining momentum, with communities unearthing and rebuilding these crucial links to past generations. While generally supportive of the project to move the graves, Hairston worries about the indignity of exhuming the graves of people who were brutalized as slaves and exploited as sharecroppers. It seems that 100 or so odd years after their death, there's still no rest, he said. Absolutely. But when you don't think of someone as human, You don't afford them any creature comforts, now do you? But ask them to exhume their family pet from the backyard, and oh, the hell there will be to pay. Listen to that again. The largest enslaver in the South. Oak Hill was part of a family empire that enslaved thousands of people across 45 plantations and farms in 4 states. According to The Hairstons, a 1999 book by Henry Weincheck, my apologies for mispronunciations, that chronicles the black and white Hairston families. I want you to take a moment and think about how the black Hairston family came to be. Samuel Hairston, the plantation owner, was reputedly the largest enslaver in the South, Weincheck wrote. But the grand property has stood mostly empty and unused since sharecropping ended last century. The 1820s plantation house was destroyed by a fire in 1988. Meaning, their only means of profit was blackness. Many who were enslaved at Oak Hill left after emancipation, Weincheck wrote. Those who remained as tenant farmers were often cheated of wages, often consistently, and faced crushing poverty and sometimes violence in the Jim Crow South. Every day, consistent violence in the Jim Crow South. Some tenant farmers took the Hairston surname, in part because we had no other name to identify with as the government was collecting data for the census. We brought no last name with us from Africa, Cedric Hairston said, adding, many of our women carried and birthed a Hairston child, never with the support of the law to report that they were raped. The law knew. And that's why they carried the name. And just as today, your pets carry your surname. Once again, listen to that again. The search for Fleming Adams Sr. One of the sharecroppers was Fleming Adams Sr., Bennett's great-great-great-grandfather, known as Flem. He was born into slavery on another plantation in 1830. He later worked at Oak Hill, where he had to duck through doorways because he was so tall, Bennett said. Adams and his wife Martha raised 3 sons, George, Daniel, and Flem Jr. Before he died in 1916, his death certificate lists his burial place as Oak Hill. My hope is that we discover where Flem is, Bennett says. He was 7 feet tall, so they'd be looking for a bigger coffin, and hopefully there'd be enough of his remains where they could do a DNA sample. There may not have been a coffin. Most of the graves in the 2 secluded sharecropper cemeteries were marked only by moss-covered stones without inscriptions. Rows of depressions in the earth showed where the wooden coffins had collapsed below, needless from low-blowing pines covering many of the plots. Because their burials were handled by fellow sharecroppers and enslaved individuals who weren't given the same tools and privileges as others. Open to any and everything. The public entity, the Pittsylvania Danville Regional Industrial Facility Authority, acquired 3,500 acres of land that included the former Oak Hill Plantation, and Tennessee-based Microforest announced in November it would build a $1.3 billion battery production facility there. It expects to create 2,000 jobs. Why was this land even available to be purchased? Because if those bodies were not melanated, this wouldn't be a topic of discussion. no one would have even considered purchasing the land for anything more than preservation. Virginia's Department of Historical Resources granted a permit in late November to move the graves, noting that relocation is consistent with the desires of the descendant families. Bennett and others visited the sites in December. So it sounds like this was granted before the families were consulted. Silence fell as they walked into the first cemetery. J.D. Adams, an Oak Hill descendant, said a historical marker must be placed there. It won't be. Look at Lake Lanier. It won't be. We need some time in order to determine what it is we want and how we want it, Adams told Matt Rowe, Pennsylvania County's Economic Development Director. I told you they made that decision before consulting the families and lying about what the families wanted, because of course they still believe that they can tell us what we want, what will bring us comfort, and what is respectful and respectable for and to us. Rowe replied, I'm open to any and everything. No, you're not. The Industrial Authority has raised $1.3 million from logging the land to fund the project, which is being handled by engineering and consulting company WSP. They will say anything to get to the profits, because as always, profit over people and profit over preservation of proper history. WSP's archaeologist John Bettle said everything would be collected from each grave shaft, even if it's mostly soil, and transferred to its new space, including the stone that marked it. No, it won't. They want the land. And what has fertilized that land has been the people. Mementos of past lives. Bennett and others recently viewed personal items found in the graves. Protected in plastic bags, they included eyeglasses, a medicine bottle, and a 5-cent coin from 1836. One man was buried with a light bulb, socket, and electrical cord. Another man's grave was lined with bricks, indicating he was wealthy, Bennett said. If black people are going to do anything, they are going to preserve history to move forward for future generations. In the event, because we know how we had to be buried, we were dug up, you'd know. These bricks will be repurposed at the new burial site, possibly in the memorial archway, and inscribed with the names of the deceased, he said. Why? Why must you alter our traditions and disrespect where our ancestors lay? If you buried your mama with something, would you want me to dig it up and repurpose it and inscribe others' names on it? Descendants are reviewing funeral home records to try to identify those buried in unmarked graves. What funeral home records? They barely care about chronicling us today. Given the challenging nature of the task, they may inscribe the names of everyone who lived in the area. So just making up history to appease. Noted. This is why there are so many addendums to our history. I feel like we're re-emphasizing the significance of our ancestors, Bennett said. It's been generations since people used that area to bury people, and now we're rediscovering their stories, and hopefully we can continue to tell these stories to the next generation. Are you rediscovering their stories, or are you allowing someone else to write their stories to make it more comfortable and palatable for those that ain't like us?